Welcome to Literary Latte, the podcast with a Southern accent on writing. I'm Lynda Bouchard, and it's time for your jolt of literary inspiration. We could all use more creativity in our writing life. Sometimes we just need a bit of a reality check and some encouragement, and a writing conference is the perfect place for that. Sure, you can learn a lot online and by reading books about the craft of writing, but nothing beats the authentic engagement and energy of meeting fellow writers and publishing industry pros face to face. So if attending a writers' conference is on your to-do list, then this episode is for you. With me today are two special guests. Each will share a unique perspective on the value of a writers' conference. First up is Landis Wade, who will talk about it from an author's point of view. And then Ed Southern, Executive Director of the North Carolina Writers Network, will take us behind the scenes and share his insider perspective. They'll break it down for us. You'll find out what to expect, how to plan for one, how to get the most out of one, why writing conferences can be a game changer for a writer, and why all are not created equal. So let's get to it. Joining me in studio from Charlotte, North Carolina is award-winning author, podcast host, and recovering attorney, Landis Wade. Landis is the author of a popular Christmas courtroom adventure trilogy, which includes The Christmas Heist, A Legally Binding Christmas, and The Christmas Redemption, which won the 2017 National Indie Excellence Award in the holiday category. The series has been described as a cross between My Cousin Vinny and A Miracle on 34th Street. I just love his books, and especially the Judge, Augustus Langhorne Stark. I mean, come on, what a great name. Landis is a fellow podcaster and host of Charlotte Readers Podcast. He is also a member of the North Carolina Writers Network, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you, Landis.
Hey, Lynda, I'm so happy to be here. Okay,
before we get started, I've got to say that you are without a doubt the coolest lawyer I've ever known. I mean, I think...
No, let's not go that far now.
I think if Matlock and Atticus Finch had a child, it would be you.
Okay. Well, thank you anyway for that. Being cool, that's nice at age 62 to be cool again. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Oh, well, it's true. Well, today our focus is writing conferences and what writers can gain by attending one. But let's start, Landis, with your writing journey. There's always something in a writer's life that starts them down that path to writing. So what's the backstory to your writing life and to your Christmas trilogy?
Yeah, people ask me, well, why does a lawyer write about Christmas? Well, you know, I've been writing all my life, but mostly things that people don't want to read because it's written like a lawyer. And one Thanksgiving, I used to write a lot of stories that never got finished because I'd write on the weekends or around the holidays or Christmas, and I'd never finish it because I had to go back to work, I had to go back to practicing law. There was this one Thanksgiving in my mid-50s. My wife Janet loves Miracle on 34th Street. It was playing on the television. It was that scene, y'all probably remember it, near the end, St. Nick's on trial. All the letter carriers come in, and he's the lawyer that proves once and for all that Santa Claus is real. Well, I was actually working on another story, some kind of assault case or something, and I thought, I wonder if I could write a story set entirely in the courtroom that involved Christmas. And so I started writing, and I became kind of obsessed with it over the next 30 days. And I'd come home at night, and my wife said, well, where are you going? And I said, well, I'm going to find out what happens next. And I just kind of got really interested in this story, and I finished it, and I gave it to my family for Christmas, and my kids looked at me like it was socks or something, and instead of electronics. And
right.
And that was it. That was the start. And I got an editor and published a better version of it the next Christmas, and found that I really enjoyed the writing process and the publishing process. So I repeated it with the second, and then came up with an idea to how to wrap it up with the trilogy.
Right, which was an award-winning finish.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. That was I was humbled to get that award, and thankful to have it. And I enjoyed sort of the arc. I mean, there's an arc in every book, of course, there has to be, and I have to learn these things. I didn't know what I was doing when I started. I'm still learning every day, which gets into the writing conference piece we're going to talk about.
Yes.
But also learn that a trilogy has to have an arc. You know, you have to have an arc within a book, you have an arc within a trilogy. And the one person that I hadn't developed as well as I should have was the villain. You know, this little dwarf who we knew was from the North Pole, but nobody else believed it. But what was his backstory, and why was he interfering with all these Christmas trials, and why was he making this lawyer's life so miserable in the courtroom? And we find out in book 3, because he's someone we didn't expect, and he's someone that helps actually save the day in the third book. And I didn't realize I was really writing a theme too, and the theme started to emerge, and it was, you know, sort of believing in things you can't, you know, feel, you know, see or touch. And that whole idea of believing in something based on faith kind of took hold, and it kind of drove me through. Plus, I had a lot of fun. I brought in modern technology and flash drive in the first book, drones in the second book, global warming is melting the North Pole in the third book. So yeah, we had a lot of fun with that.
Did you just sit down and go for it?
Well, I'd been writing as a lawyer, you know, for 30-some years, and I'd taken a lot of courses. The one thing that's valuable, and we talk about this on my podcast some with people who are journalists who become writers, and lawyers too to some extent, is that you're taught to write briefs. Lawyers don't always do it. They're usually longer than they should be. But you're taught to write succinctly and in a way that can get your point across quickly. And if you're writing something that has a good pace to it, that's important. I'm not a literary fiction guy, right? So I write, you know, more of a pace kind of book. So that part of it helped me. But I had to unlearn certain things that you learn as a lawyer. And that's where the writing courses came in. That's where the editor came in. That's where, you know, getting a good editor, I think, whether you're publishing, self-publishing, or with a small press or whatever, is very important. You know, don't just toss it out there and put it up, but actually go out there and get somebody to give you some feedback. It's not always easy, a little painful to see all the red marks on the page, but they turn into better ideas. Once you get over your ego problem that, you know, the first draft wasn't as good as you thought it might be.
Yes.
And then you come up with these other ideas because your editor has pushed you in a certain direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's great advice for other writers out there, Landis, because the editing process, someone said there's no such thing as great writing, only great rewriting.
Exactly.
So it's so important, and so many authors, like you said, their egos are invested in it, and they don't want that editing to their detriment, really.
Yeah, and that sometimes happens in writers' conferences too, where people have a hard time, you know, getting feedback. But feedback is very important because you can't always see, you know, your own mistakes. You might get caught up in something and you think you know what you're conveying. But I learned this lesson very early on, right? If the reader doesn't understand, you know, what you're intending, it's not their fault.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
And so we have that solitary endeavor of writing a book, and then there's the more public part of it, which is book signings and events and so forth. And how did you feel about going out there and promoting your book? And talk about the book signing experiences that you've had. And I know there was a really heartwarming one with a Christmas heist at Park Road Books. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's always fun to go out to a book signing and see people show up because you never know whether you're going to have one person, whether you're New York Times bestselling or you're self-publishing or you're somewhere in between. You don't know if anybody's going to show up or not. But I was fortunate that on my first book, I at least had enough friends in the neighborhood to show up, and we had a good little crowd there. And I look over and there's a little boy standing in the aisle, and he's listening intently. And, you know, I think I talked about the People's Court where this was said, and you mentioned Judge Augustus Langhorne Stark, who didn't believe, and all these different things. And after everybody clears out, he comes up to me and he's standing there, and I'm looking down at him, and he looks to be about 8 or 9 years old, and he says, "Sir, I believe in Santa Claus. Can I read your book?" And so I knelt down, I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, "Now look, there are a lot of adults in this book who don't believe. There's the judge, there's the prosecutor, there's the court reporter, there's the reporter, there's people in the audience. They don't believe. But if you'll read all the way to the end of this book, you'll find out they're wrong." And he said, "Oh, good, I'm going to go talk to my mom and get her to buy the book." It's really been, heartwarming to write a story that, people can relate to, that helps bring back fun memories at Christmas. I had a lawyer who sent me an email that meant a lot. He just said, "I read your book. My father's just died. He loved Christmas all his life, and I hadn't been observing as well. And this book just really spurred me on to want to celebrate Christmas more." And I thought, that's cool. That's great.
And you know what I loved about your books, not only the content, but the covers. The covers are great. So who worked on your covers for you?
Sue Frew from Norman, Oklahoma. She used to do artwork for the post office, and she had retired, and she was doing art covers. And I called her, and I got put in touch with her by my editor, and I said, "I'd really like sort of a National Lampoonish looking cover, because as you said, it's this cross My Cousin Vinny, Miracle on 34th Street." And she said, "Okay." And she came back with these really nice covers. Now, one thing about them is you look at them and you think, well, that might be a children's book, and but it's more meant in the vein of National Lampoon Christmas.
Talk about writing conferences. Now, you're a member of the North Carolina Writers Network, which has a fall conference coming up next month in November. And writing conferences are an important way to connect with other writers and meet folks from the publishing industry. And so from a perspective as an author, talk about the value of belonging to the North Carolina Writers Network, and maybe 3 things that writers can look forward to at the fall conference. And tack on to that how it's different from other conferences you've attended.
Well, when I first wrote that book, and I was looking around because I wanted to find a community of writers. One of the places I found was local, the Charlotte Writers Club, but I also found the North Carolina Writers Network, which is on a more of a statewide level. And I went to the Squire Writing Conference they had in the summer up at Appalachian, met a number of people through that conference. That was a weekend conference. I went to their spring conferences, which they usually have as a one-day conference. And then I went to their fall conference last year. And every conference I attended with North Carolina Writers Network, I learned something about writing craft and the business and marketing of writing. So each time I go, I learn something new. And that's what, I think any writer, no matter how good they are, is always trying to learn something new, right? You're always trying to get better at your craft. And this is one organization that does a great job. They bring a lot of resources to bear from other writers around the state who provide the expertise to make these conferences worth their while. And so that's one thing. The second is, through going to these conferences, I've met and become friends and colleagues with a number of people, both locally and from around the state, who also have, a passion for writing. Which is helpful for me as a writer. It's helpful for me as a podcast host who brings authors on to read their work, because I'm meeting interesting writers, from around the state. And then I guess the third is that the Writers Network is it's a large but also small in feel community of writers, and I want to be part of a community of writers, and that's a great place to do it. Mm-hmm. Now, how it's different, like this conference they're having in the fall, they offer a lot of options. They offer master classes in fiction, nonfiction, or they call it creative nonfiction, I think, and then poetry. They offer smaller classes on all kinds of things you can select, and then they have a keynote address, the Friday night, and they have another address at lunch, and then they have these manuscript marts, and they have so it's a large collection where you can sort of pick different things that you want to do. You're not just And then they offer different options for the different kind of conferences that you go to. So it's a very valuable part of the writing community in North Carolina.
You really have to be organized and kind of map it out before you go so you can hit what you want to hit and be really kind of more constructive with your time.
Yeah, well, of course, if you're signing up for a master class, you would have already done that. Well, you can do that in advance to sign up for that.
Right.
And you'll have certain segments that will be devoted to that. If you're not, they've got their program online at the North Carolina Writers Net website that you can go through and pick out, different classes you'd like to do, which is what I'm going to do before I go. Because in addition to being an exhibitor, I'm going to sneak off and go to a few classes while I'm there.
And it's an important takeaway that no matter whether you're an author, a publishing pro, or an agent, or just curious about being there, it's a real magnet for storytelling. And, there's nothing, the energy is palpable. There's nothing like it at a writer's conference. So you attended a writer's workshop in Brevard, North Carolina, with Craig Johnson, author of the Longmire series, and you wrote an article for Writer's Digest about it. What?
I did. Yeah, that was the Looking Glass Rock Writers Conference, and it was a fabulous conference. And the first thing I learned was the value of how Craig Johnson chose to run his workshop. He sort of ditched the MFA model, which is not a bad model. I'm not criticizing that, but he came to realize that there were there were 12 of us in the room. We all come from different backgrounds, writing different genres, and his approach was to, hey, I'm going to talk to y'all for 3 days about writing and give you my expertise, which is where the 47 Things came from. Here's how it starts out. The title is 47 Things Longmire author Craig Johnson Taught Me About Writing Fiction. Many great writers don't know how to talk about their craft, or worse, they're unwilling to do so. Not so with Craig Johnson, author of the best-selling Western crime novel series featuring protagonist Walt Longmire, which was adapted into the Longmire television series of the same name that ran for 6 seasons. Johnson speaks about his craft unselfishly, with a purpose and in good humor, and like the sheriff in his Longmire novels, he will stare down any would-be writer who says the challenge is too great and add the undersheriff's colorful language to punctuate his point. He got right to the point, saying he was going to disclose 47 things we needed to know. And then he panned the room, much like Walt Longmire might mentally dissect a group of suspects. Quote, I believe in mechanics, close quote. Somewhere down the list here he says, hunt down new ideas with a passion. He says, find your weaknesses and work on them. And the last, I like this one, read. He says, my idea of hell is being stuck somewhere without a book. And then he says, don't run from conflict, chase it down. It's the lifeblood of what you're doing. And then don't beat yourself up. Sit at your desk and write. You deserve to be there. It was really refreshing to hear someone that was as successful as he was talk about the fact, and I think he even said, when he was talking about the mechanics, he said, you have to attack your writing like digging a ditch. And then he said, scratch that, because one of his tips was to limit the use of dialogue tags. Just dig the damn ditch. So he's like, okay, let's dig a ditch. Let's get this thing moving. And, so so you get inspired at writing conferences like that. And I've, at the North Carolina Writers Network conferences, I've been inspired as well by very successful writers who will drop these tips in. It's energizing to go somewhere, put everything else down, and pick up your pen or your laptop, listen to someone, and then see where that takes you.
So in closing, Landis, what writerly advice do you have for those who haven't been to a writer's conference and maybe are on the fence?
But really think that it's important to recognize that everyone has their own voice. You don't have to be like someone else to be a good, successful, whatever the term success means to you, writer. Find your voice. Tell your own stories. I often thought that because I was a lawyer, because I had these many years in the courtroom, that I had to write, just what I knew. Everybody's got stories. So I guess my advice is everybody's got a voice. Use your own voice. Tell your own story.
That's just great. My guest has been author and podcast host Landis Wade. I'll have a link to his website, landiswade.com, in the show notes where you can find out more about Landis and his work. And I'll also have a link to the article he wrote about the workshop with Craig Johnson. And hey, folks, Christmas is just around the corner. So if you're looking for that perfect stocking stuffer, you can pick up his Christmas Courtroom Trilogy at your favorite booksellers. And if you want to meet Landis in person, look for him in the vendor room at the North Carolina Network's Fall Conference in Asheville, North Carolina, November 8th through the 10th, where he'll be sharing information about his podcast. And you'll find more information about the conference in the show notes. Landis Wade, thank you so much for being my guest today and for sharing your brilliant insights.
Lynda, thank you so much for having me and for what you're doing with this podcast.
You've just heard terrific advice about the importance of attending a writing conference from an author's point of view. Now let's go behind the scenes and find out how it all comes together. My next guest offers an insider perspective. I'm thrilled to welcome Ed Southern, Executive Director of the North Carolina Writers Network. You might call him the wizard behind the curtain who seamlessly brings together talented writers, workshop leaders, and award-winning authors to each of the network's conferences. Ed was Vice President of Sales and Marketing for John F. Blair Publishers before becoming Executive Director of the North Carolina Writers Network. He is the author of 4 books, including a short story collection titled Parlous Angels. He is also editor of an anthology, Sports in the Carolinas. Ed received the 2015 Fortner Award from St. Andrews University for his service to the literary arts in North Carolina. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you, Ed.
Thank you, Lynda. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, I know you are preparing for your fall conference, which is being held the weekend of November 8th in Asheville, North Carolina. But before we get to that, let's talk about the purpose of the North Carolina Writers Network and how it came to be.
Well, the North Carolina Writers Network was founded in 1985 around a kitchen table to bring together writers in all genres, all creative genres, to connect, educate, promote, lead, nurture North Carolina's literary community. Right now, so we'll be celebrating our 35th, yes, birthday next year. Right now, we've got about 1,400 members all across the state and beyond. You don't have to live or be from North Carolina to be a part of the network. We try to be as open and welcoming as we can be.
Okay, great. And that brings up a point. Why would somebody outside of North Carolina or the Carolinas join your network? We
provide resources and services throughout the year for our members, including a critiquing and editing service. We post job opportunities, calls for submission, articles that we hope are helpful and of interest to writers. We also do two major conferences every year, a spring conference and the fall conference that you mentioned, as well as the Squire Summer Writing Workshops every year. So we offer a lot for writers, and not every state is fortunate enough to have an organization like this and frankly, a community like this.
Yes, it is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for writers because, a conference is a time really of refreshment and maybe renewed commitment for an author. Because as writers, this, Ed, we sit in a room and it's a very solitary endeavor. So doing that day in and day out makes it easy to forget that there's a whole community of writers out there who love contributing to other writers' successes,
Mm-hmm.
and your network provides that. What makes the fall conference or even the spring conference, what sets them apart?
Yes, well, there's a difference between the spring and the fall conference other than season. The spring conference is just a one-day event, and it's always held at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So there's a lot packed into that one day. The fall conference is a 3-day event beginning Friday night with our opening reception and keynote address, which this year will be by Ron Rash. And then going into a full day of workshops, panel discussions, a luncheon and a banquet on Saturday, and then a half day on Sunday. So the fall conference is really our premier event in a lot of ways. I mean, that's the event that or the program that we're best known for. And I've heard it referred to as a smorgasbord for writers. I don't know that I would claim that, but we do try to offer a lot. We try to exhaust you, but in a good way by the end of the weekend. We've got 5 sessions of classes that you can take. We've got master classes that you can apply for. We always have some sort of performance or reading at the luncheon on Saturday, as well as at the banquet on Saturday night. And I think when you ask what sets it apart from other writers' conferences, and I've been to some great writers' conferences around the country. I would never disparage those. But one thing that we strive for at the network's fall conference is to be as egalitarian as we can, to be as welcoming as we can, to avoid cliques or cliquishness or any sense that you have to be that you have to sort of pass an initiation to be one of us or something, or have a certain number of publications to be accepted. We try very hard to welcome with open arms writers at all levels of skill and experience, whether you are a complete novice who has just decided to put pen to paper, or whether you have, 4 or 5 books to your credit. Either way, we want you to feel welcome there.
Yes, and that's one of the beauties of your conference, or really any writing conference, because you find writers who are at every level of their craft, and everybody learns from each other. And, writing conferences can be overwhelming, as you know, and there's so many workshops and choices. So what would you suggest, Ed, the best way to prepare for a conference in order to get the most out of it?
Bank up some sleep in the few days before the conference starts. Stretch well and hydrate, because you're going to be running around doing a lot of stuff and listening a lot. No, I would, at least for our conferences, we don't require, but we strongly encourage people to pre-register, to register in advance. We do accept walk-in registrants the day of during the conference, but you probably won't get your first choice of classes if you do that. So we encourage you to register beforehand, so you know what classes you're going to be taking when you show up. And I think I would encourage you to read the books or the work that's out there by the instructors that you're going to be in class with, to know where they're coming from, to know what their work is like, to have an idea of what you can expect, to make sure that this is the right class for you. I would encourage you to this may sound a little bit silly, but most writers are introverts. Not all, by any means, but I'd say a majority of them are. And writing is such an isolating, or can be such an isolating occupation, that I encourage writers, and I do this before I go to a conference, spend a little bit of time psyching yourself up so that you're ready to go out and meet people, because it is sort of a change of attitude. A friend of mine who's published, I don't even know how many novels, says that writers these days are expected to be schizophrenics, in that to be a writer, you have to be comfortable in your little basement room, your little attic, wherever it is, your little corner of the coffee shop, wherever it is that you do your writing, and comfortable living inside your own head and shutting out distractions and focusing on these characters that you're imagining, this story that you're conjuring to yourself. And then if you're lucky, you get published. And if you're very lucky, you get sent out on a book tour. And if you're extremely lucky, people show up for your book tour. And then you're expected to be an author, which is a whole different kind of creature. As an author, you're expected to be outgoing and engaging and appealing and know the right shoes to wear, and all this sort of thing, all these sorts of things that don't necessarily come naturally to most writers or to many writers. And it's sort of the same thing going to a conference. I mean, I hope that anyone who registers for one of our conferences is excited to be meeting other writers and to be getting to know other writers. And whatever nervousness that you might have, I hope you'll spend some time talking yourself out of that, because there's no need for it. We hope that everyone there will be welcoming. After
a book is published, you have to think of it as a product, and you do have to put yourself out there, and that is not always a comfortable place for writers, but it is necessary, and it's a growing experience for writers. It's always a process of self-discovery in that regard. So do you think there is ever a point where classes and conferences are no longer useful to a writer?
I'm going to get to that question in a second. I'm going to back up and not really take issue with, but push back just slightly on one thing that you said. I think the public part of being an author, of getting out there, is necessary only if your goal as a writer is to be an author, to be published, to have multiple publications, to sell books, go on book tours, do readings. In that case, yes, that's necessary. You've got to be able to put yourself out there in all sorts of ways that you may not be comfortable with. But a lot of writers, their only goal as writers is to write. They simply enjoy the craft of it. And we do want to make clear that the network is a welcoming place for those writers as well. That even if you just like to write for yourself, just for your own enjoyment of the craft, of the art, we're still here for you. We don't want people thinking of the network, oh, that's only for people who are looking to get published. We're for all sorts of writers with all sorts of goals. To answer your other question about, or your actual question about, is there a point when conferences and classes are no longer necessary? Yes and no, because on the one hand, if you're okay, I'll pick on our this year's keynote speaker as an example, Ron Rash. I don't know what Ron Rash at this point in his career could learn from the average workshop or class. I mean, he's accomplished so much as a writer. He may disagree with me with that statement, by the way. He may say, oh, no, there's tons that I could learn taking the class. I wish I had the time to take a class again. I wish that, he may wish that his presence wouldn't imbalance a class.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just, like I say, using him as a hypothetical example. But what a writer of his stature, or someone like Lee Smith or Jill McCorkle or Clyde Edgerton, this is the point. And fortunately, in North Carolina, most of our established writers have a very strong feeling that they need now to give back, that, they were helped along the way. They were instructed, they were guided, they were nurtured, they were encouraged, and now it's their turn to do that for others. So that you've got Ron agreeing to give the keynote address at our fall conference. You got the last time we had our fall conference in Asheville, Lee Smith gave the keynote address and taught a class. Unfortunately, Ron's schedule isn't going to allow him to do that this time, but he's happy to give what time he can. And that I have found, again, and I'm very lucky. It's one of the blessings of being in North Carolina, because it is such a strong and nurturing community that, that's why the established writers feel they need conferences and classes, is that this is their chance to give back.
Why do you call North Carolina the writingest state?
Well, actually, that was a line by Doris Betts, the late great novelist and writing instructor Doris Betts, in an interview, I believe it was sometime in the 1990s, described North Carolina as the writingest state. And we latched onto that at the network and have sort of made that our motto. We feel that North Carolina is an especially fertile ground for writers. That, we've got so many writers in all corners of this state, from Manio to Murphy, Calabash to Crumpler. You find the writers thick on the ground. I can go through and name, the famous ones, from Charles Chestnut to Thomas Wolfe to Paul Green to Doris Betts, to John Ely, to Lee Smith, Joe McCorkle, Clyde Edgerton, Randall Keenan, to Ron Rash, to now David Joy and Wiley Cash. I mean, there are so many writers that are still on their way up. There are so many writers that are still plugging away. We could not be more fortunate in this state.
Absolutely. And, being a regional writer has great value. Not everybody needs to be a blockbuster, best-selling, New York Times. I mean, sure, Ron Rash is, but also being a regional writer is amazing. You can become incredibly, well-known just by being a regional writer.
Well, I sort of reject the distinction between a regional writer and a national writer, because oftentimes has nothing to do with the quality of the work and more to do with oftentimes just sheer luck, being in the right place at the right time, having your book come out at the right time so that it strikes a chord with readers across the country. Connections that a writer may have or may have developed. I can think of any number of writers who may have only a regional readership, but are every bit the writer, produce stories just as good as those, with a more national audience.
Yes, and even though it may be regional, there are universal themes in it. So that is often the case, yes. So what is one habit, Ed, that you wish all writers would adopt?
Oh, boy. That's a tough one, because I've long felt strongly that I once heard a poet say that, a very well-regarded poet years and years ago, say that in order to write poetry, you must read poetry out loud for 30 minutes every day. And I remember thinking that unless you can prove to me that Wordsworth and Emily Dickinson and T.S. Eliot and whoever else you want to name did that, then I don't think that's true. I mean, you write the way that you find best. I think the one practice that I would encourage all writers to have is work hard at it. And that means not just getting up and putting words down on the page every day, though that is important, but then really digging into those words and making sure that they're the best words that you can send out into the world, that you have said just what you mean to say in the best way that you can say it, that you've told a good story well. Really care. I mean, it's a big responsibility writers have in a lot of ways, and I would just want writers to take that responsibility seriously. Maybe not take themselves seriously, but take the job seriously.
I love that. Yes, and because, as you know, the words you write will far outlive the author. So they should take care in making the words great. Yes. So in closing, Ed, what is the most important thing that a conference attendee can expect from your conference in November?
Whew. On just the very practical level, I hope that that each person who comes to one of our conferences goes away feeling like I got my money's worth. Well, unless you're on scholarship, in which case, but I hope they each go away saying, I got good value out of that investment of my registration fee, of my time, of my energy. That was worthwhile. I hope that each writer comes away feeling that I have found the community I was looking for, whatever shape that community might take. Some writers, want to come away with a lot of writer friends. Some writers would prefer, if I just meet one or two sympathetic fellow writers, then that's enough community for me. So whichever it is, I hope that a conference goer feels that they did that by the end of our fall conference. So I think those two would be my, if we meet those two expectations for every writer who comes, then I'd be satisfied.
Absolutely. And thank you for reminding us that writers' conferences aren't just about learning how to write, but they may be far more about learning what it means to be a writer. My guest has been Ed Southern, Executive Director of the North Carolina Writers Network. Their fall conference is being held in Asheville, North Carolina, November 8th through 10th. And you'll find a link in the show notes where you can register for the conference and find out much more about the North Carolina Writers Network. Ed Southern, thank you for being my guest and for all you do for writers.
Oh, thank you, Lynda. I had a great time.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your tribe and be sure to go to Apple Podcasts to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast. Join me next time for another Southern-laced literary conversation.
You've been listening to Literary Latte with Lynda Bouchard. For more information, visit bookingauthorsinc.com.